it's a good idea to build a table as a workspace. In this case, a couple of sawhorses, a piece of plywood, and the plywood needs to be thick enough that it supports whatever it is you're doing. In this case, a piece of 5/8" CDX plywood. The next thing I'm going to do is take my screw gun and some drywall screws and just screw that down so that when I'm working, my table isn't moving around, and that's one thing I don't have to think about. The next thing we want to do is lay out our framing material on our table. It's probably a good idea to talk at this point about what the names of these pieces are, because they've had names for a long time. The two pieces at the ends, the bottom and the top of the flat, are called end rails. The pieces on the sides, usually the longest pieces, are called the stiles. And the centerpiece, there could be many of them, but in this case there's one, it's called a toggle. You'll notice I'm laying out this flat on the corner of my table. I trust this sheet of plywood very much. I trust the fact that it's square. And in this case, for something fairly large, it's about as big a framing square as you can find. So we're going to use that to help us square up the material. Also, I don't want it to move around. So I think what I'm going to do next is I'm going to attach these pieces to my table so that they don't move. That way I can save a couple of hands. And I'm going to make sure that it's lined up very nicely on the end of my plywood. You'll also notice I'm putting my screws in a particular location that is inside of where my corner blocks are going to be in a moment, so that I don't build the whole flat having it screwed down to the table before I start. Now that we have the flat laid out on the table, we need to assemble it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a corner block to this corner. And we don't want to, when we go to do that, we don't want to put the corner block right in the corner of the flat, because if we were to have another flat that lines up to it in some way, it's going to get in the way of that attachment. So we want to always lay our corner blocks and our keystones in a certain distance from the edge. Ideally, that distance would be the thickness of whatever the flats are that we're building. And in this case, we're building a hardcover flat, and that means that the flat is going to be the thickness of our material here, which is 3/4 of an inch, plus the thickness of the cover, which is 1/4 of an inch, so 1 inch total. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to take a piece of my framing and a piece of quarter ply, and I'm going to mark the corner so that I'm sure not to attach the corner block outside that line. And then I'm going to mark all the other corners while I'm here. Okay, now those are all marked. Now I'm ready to attach my corner block, my first corner block. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mark the corner block so that, because I need to use some glue to attach this. And it's a good idea to not have glue going everywhere in your world. Otherwise, we would just glue the entire back of the corner block, but we'd be dropping glue here, and that would make a mess for someone down the road. So I'm going to put a little glue here. Then I'm going to lay the corner block down. And really, the glue is going to do the majority of the work for us. But I'm going to go ahead and staple that in place, because we need time for the glue to dry and we don't have time to wait around. The 4 most important staples that we're going to use, there is a pattern that's important, and the 4 most important staples are 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the 4 staples, 2 on either side of this joint for our material right here, and that's what's really going to hold this in place for us. And then from there, we'll do the corners. And then it's a good idea just to create triangles, like that. And that makes it stronger. So in this case, 9 fasteners, I guess actually 10 fasteners. The most important ones, though, are right here. Don't take those for granted. Now, ultimately, the glue will dry, and this will be a very strong butt joint. Notice that my frame is a little bit bowed out there, so I'm going to make sure to take care of that as I do it. So now I'm going to attach this keystone. This is really called a strap, but that's another story. Again, the 4 staples on either side of the joint are the most important. Now that I've attached all the corner blocks and keystones and made sure my toggle was centered on the flat, I'm going to check the entire flat for squareness by going from diagonal to diagonal, measuring that distance. In this case, it's 80 and 5/8 inches. And hopefully we'll discover that it's 80 and 5/8 inches this way, and in fact it is. So we know that it's nice and square. So now we've finished framing the flat, but it's not a finished flat yet. We still need to cover it in some way. And this is probably a good time to talk about the fact that at this point, it's a good idea to go around with sandpaper and clean off the edges of the flat, especially if you're going to soft cover the flat, because you don't want splinters sticking up through the muslin as the painters receive the project. The other good idea is to come around on the back side and kind of clean up any splinters or any of that sort of thing that you might have, just so they're nice for people to handle. As always, when you're finished with your project, it's a good idea to clean up your mess.